What are the four lobes of the brain?
There are 4 lobes on each hemisphere of the brain.
The frontal lobe,
The parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Each lobe performs specific functions in the brain. The frontal lobe is situated at the front of the brain and is the largest lobe.
It makes
1/3 of the total brain. The frontal lobe has many functions, including 1. Executive function. Executive function is associated with attention, planning, selection, sequential organization, and self-monitoring of action. 2. Memory. Memory such as working memory, learning, and long-term memory. 3. Language.
including language
processing and production.
4. Self-awareness. 5. Audition.
The primary auditory cortex responsible of processing sound is in the frontal lobe.
6. Voluntary motor movements.
The primary motor cortex responsible of voluntary movements is also in the frontal lobe.
7. Personality. Lesions of the frontal lobe have been shown to affect personality. 8. Affect and mood.
Alterations in the frontal lobe function have been shown to correlate with depression.
9. Emotional and social response associated with behavioral response in a specific context. What happens if the frontal lobe is damaged?
Damages to the
Frontal lobe leads to disorders including attention deficits, significant impairment in routine daily life, deficits in learning and long-term memory, speech and language impairments, such as Broca's aphasia and transcortical motor aphasia, sudden and profound changes in personality,
depression, impairment in the ability to recollect
past events and connect them with future plans,
impairment in spatial reasoning and motor
skills,
and disinhibition. The parietal lobe is situated between the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe. The parietal lobe has many functions including calculation and arithmetic, spatial orientation, processing of tactile information, known as touch perception, tactile discrimination, temperature sensing,
body position and movement,
visual and movement coordination,
and understanding of grammatical syntactical aspects of language, known as syntax.
Damages to the parietal lobe have been associated with disorders and conditions such as isolated loss of discriminating sensations, also known as cortical sensory syndrome,
Weakness of one side of the body,
known as hemiparesis, visual field loss,
and loss of eye movements. In addition, damages affecting the parietal lobe of the right hemisphere result in loss of self-orientation,
loss of
topographic memory, which is the capacity to recall shapes, contours, structure, and design,
inability to
recognize own condition, known as anosognosia,
inability to dress,
difficulty to draw or assemble objects, known as constructional apraxia,
a loss of response
to visual stimuli in one half of visual field,
confusion, and the inability to open the eyes at will.
Damages that affect the parietal lobe of the left hemisphere result in language disorder,
Gerstmann syndrome, which is an impairment of the ability to write, difficulty learning or comprehending calculation and arithmetic,
and the inability to distinguish hand fingers, and left-right disorientation, inability to recognize objects by palpation, known as tactile agnosia, and the inability to perform previously experienced movements despite adequate sensory and motor abilities. The temporal lobe is delimited by the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The temporal lobe contains important structures including the limbic lobe, the Wernicke's area, Broca's area, and the primary auditory cortex. The limbic lobe contains the hippocampus and the amygdala that are important for memory, learning, and attention processing, and for unconscious body and emotional states. The Wernicke's area is important for speech understanding and processing, while Broca's area is involved in speech production.
The primary auditory cortex is responsible for the processing of auditory information, or sound.
Damages of the temporal lobe have been associated with impairment in auditory sensation and perception, altered personality and affective behavior,
impairment of visual perception, disturbance in language comprehension, impairment of selective attention associated with visual and auditory inputs,
impairment in speech production, and changes in sexual behavior. Finally, the occipital lobe is the smallest and most posterior lobe of the brain.
The occipital lobe controls visual functions as it contains important structures including the primary visual cortex, known as Brodmann Area 17 or V1, and the secondary visual cortex, also known as V2. V1 is the brain
processing hub for visual information.
and V2 is
involved in associating vision with past experience and helps in recognition and appreciation. Damages of the occipital lobe have been associated with epilepsy,
Visual field defects.
movement and balance difficulties, distortion in the perception of colors, shapes,
dimensions, and sizes,
Difficulties recognizing, reading, and writing words. Hallucinations.
cortical blindness, which can be a total or partial loss of vision with unaffected eyes, defects in object localization within an environment,
and impairment in the recognition of familiar faces or objects. In conclusion, although we have an overall understanding of how the brain works, there are many things we still do not understand, including the function of some specific areas of the brain lobes.
Future research in neurosciences will certainly provide new information on the function of this fascinating organ.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and share for more videos like this.